In your kit for the Dresden plate, you have 20 rectangles of 30 prints, 1 red square and 1 large white square. You should at least best press or starch or spray sizing and press dry all the rectangles. I actually did all the pieces. From our 20 rectangles, we need to cut 1 fan blade from each, and I have stacked mine up. I am going to do them 4 at a time. You don't have to do that. That's completely up to you. Now, there's a little bit of a problem because the pattern says you're just going to cut your blades with an 18-degree ruler or wedge ruler, but not all 18-degree wedge rulers are the same. So I'm going to be using the Easy Dresden, and if I cut this at 5 inches like the pattern says, then my wreath would be too big for my 12.5-inch background piece. So I'm going to be actually cutting it down to 4 inches. The reason it makes a difference, this is another 18-degree ruler that I have, and yes, the degrees are exactly the same. It just depends on how the designer did the measurements. So if I stack them on top of each other, then this one, the narrow end, actually starts about 1/2 inch further down than on the Easy Dresden. So the real difference here is how big the holes are going to be in the center of your Dresden plate. Even with this ruler, the 5 inches would have been too big for my 12.5-inch block. So I don't know what brand ruler she was using. I'm using the Easy Dresden, and I will put notes in your patterns for what the measurements should be using that. That is what's going to be your sale item this month. You're going to want a wedge ruler. Okay, so because I'm using this one, I'm going to cut these down to 4 inches on the short. I'm cutting it this way to 4 inches. I'm not going to worry about cutting the narrow side. And I do want that 4 inches to be parallel to each other. So I'm just going to cut off one edge, move my ruler over so that I have my 4-inch line on that line that I just cut. And cut. So I am wasting a lot, but I wasn't sure how much it was going to take until I came home and tested. So now I'm going to take my Easy Dresden ruler, and I want to line up my 4-inch mark with one of my edges that I just cut, and I'm going to line up my short end with the other edge, and I'm going to cut on one side. Because I have stacks, I am not moving this. Going to walk around and cut the other side, so that I get a wedge like this. So I'm going to do that with all 20 of my rectangles. And the next step is going to be to shorten the stitch length on my sewing machine. Now when I turn my sewing machine on, it automatically sets at 2.5. I reduced it to 1.5. I'm going to take my blades and I'm folding them in half, right sides together, the long way. So I want the wider edge up here is where I'm going to be sewing. I'm going to fold it in half and match it. And I'm going to sew a 1/4 inch seam along this short edge right here. Not this one, that one would be too short. So I like to sew with my 2 raw edges going in first and then off the fold. Because I've shortened my stitch length, I do not need to back stitch at the end. So 1/4 inch from the edge, and I'm going to do it on all 20 of these, and I chain piece them so I don't have to stop after every one. Once I've sewn across the tops of all my wedges, I'm going to cut them apart from my chain. And because we use that short stitch length, the seams should not pull out. So I'm going to clip the corner. Do not cut through the threads, but I'm just going to clip an angle off the corner. And then I'm going to turn this right side out. So I like to open up the seam with my fingers and turn it. And we're going to press so that seam is going right down the center. If you want to, the pattern mentions cutting cereal cardboard. This is actually just the cardboard from the back of a charm pack. We're going to put an X from point to point. Mine aren't perfect, but this one's pretty good over here. If you want to use this, then you just slide it in there and line the seam up with the mark, so right here, and then press. And we're going to do that on all of them. I actually, if I'm using the cardboard, I press and then I take it out and press again so that I get a nice crisp crease. Once you have pressed all your tops into points, then you can play with how you want to arrange your Dresden wreath. I'm still going to be sewing with a shorter stitch length. I'm going to take and sew these together in pairs, and I will start sewing up on the fold. So I'm going to sew down the long edge on the fold, and again I'm going to chain piece. So in pairs, I'm using a short stitch length so it's not going to pull out up here. I've sewn my pairs together, so now I'm going to, and oh, those were chain pieced, so I just have a long chain of these. If you want to, you can press your seams open or you can press them to one side as you go. I'm going to save mine and do it all at the end, so you can do that too, just do all your pressing at the end. Remember, this is bias, so be careful when you're handling it. I just finger pressed my seam open, and now I'm going to sew all my pairs together, so I have sets of 4, and once I get there, I'm just going to keep sewing until I have a complete circle. Here's my wreath all sewn together, and I did end up pressing all the seams open after I had the whole thing sewn together. So you'll notice that my wreath is pretty flat, and that's what we want. So to get a flat wreath, you're going to want an accurate 1/4 of an inch seam, because if you go bigger or smaller, your circle's not going to come out to exactly the right size. You also are going to want to be gentle with that bias so you do not stretch it out of shape. And avoid steam when you're pressing. Steam will stretch your pieces, and it will make it so things bubble and aren't flat. So our next step is to put it onto our background piece, and our background piece gets cut down to 12.5 inches square. I'm just going to use a square ruler that's bigger than 12.5 inches to cut mine, and you don't have a lot of extra on this. If you want to wait until after you applique because you find that your applique draws up your background fabric, then you can do that. I'm going to go ahead and cut it at 12.5 first because I want my wreath centered exactly. You can also do that with trimming later. So if you don't have a big square, you can use the lines on your cutting mat. You just need to look and see where 12.5 is. Now, there aren't full 1/2 inch marks on the cutting mat. So what I would do if I were cutting it on the mat, let's see what you can see on the camera. So if I wanted the 1/2 inch, what I would do is mark the line up the 1/2 inch mark on my straight ruler with the 1 inch mark on my mat. So when I was getting my last 1/2 inch, so notice here I have this line lined up on this line, and then I can cut, and that gives me my accurate 1/2 inch. I don't know, that may have been more confusing than helpful, but okay. But I'm just going to use a ruler. So 2 sides. I'm going to walk around because I do not want to stretch this out of shape. And the 2 sides I just cut are going to be awkward for cutting, but oh well. I'm going to cut it at 12.5. And make sure so that you don't have to come in and get more fabric. 12.5, yep. Again. Okay, so that I can get my wreath centered on this, I'm going to fold some creases in here. So I'm going to fold it in half this way and just finger press. I'm going to fold it in half this way and just finger press. And then I'm going to fold it in half on the diagonal as well. Finger press. I don't want those creases in there permanently, but I want them in there for positioning. And the other way on the diagonal. And finger press. Now, I knew where my center was with just 2 folds, but because this is a fan, those extra marks are going to help me. So when I go to line this up, I can either line it up with the points going up and down, or it could be the valleys. You just need to decide which look you like. So if it was the valleys, I'd be lining seams up on my horizontal and vertical. It would be points on the diagonal. And if I'm lining up my points, it would be just the opposite. It would be the points on the horizontal and vertical, and then it would be valleys on the diagonal. So I've centered my Dresden wreath on my background square how I want it. And I wanted to point out, and I don't know how well you can see it, I have pinned, and I have pinned a lot. I have a pin in every single blade as well as pins in the center. Some people have talked about they're having troubles with their applique that is bubbling. I pinned it on the flat surface. I didn't pin it in my lap, so especially for a piece this big. Now I'm going to hand stitch this down. I'm going to just applique it. And I've shown you how to do applique before by hand, the stitch. If you don't want to do that, you can sew it down by machine. You could just do a straight stitch. You could use a blind hem stitch with invisible thread. You could do a blanket stitch or a buttonhole stitch, either by hand or by machine. It's completely up to you, but somehow you need to stitch it down to your background square. I have stitched my Dresden wreath down, and I used one color thread all the way around, but I did use teeny tiny stitches, so you really can't see them. I also basted inside 1/4 inch seam allowance around the center hole. So now we need to cover that hole. And you can cut a template from cardboard if you want to, or if you have the bigger perfect circles, which are the heat resistant Templar, those will work. So you need to check and see how big your hole is. So mine is about 2 1/4, depending on where I measure it. I need a template to be at least a 1/2 inch bigger than that. So not 2 1/4, it was 2 3/4. So in my case, I need it to be at least 3 1/4. You can, you will need to measure your own hole, not just go by my measurement. So from your red square that's in your kit, we are going to cut a circle that's a 1/2 inch bigger than our template. And so this is the template that I picked. So I'm just going to draw my line around here. And then I'm going to cut it out roughly 1/4 inch away from that line. I'm not worried about being exact. I cut out my fabric circle 1/4 inch outside my drawn line, and I also did a running stitch inside the seam allowance. So now I'm going to take my template, whether it's cardboard or the perfect circles, or you could cut your own out of the Templar plastic. I'm just going to pull up my running stitch all the way around this, and I can nudge it a little bit so that it's even all the way around. And then I will tie that off so that it stays tight around my template. To get my circle to stay a circle, I'm going to use a little bit of sizing, or you can use best press. And I'm just going to put some of whichever I'm using into a container. With the sizing, I can just use the cap. And then I just need a small paintbrush. Any paintbrush will do. And I'm just going to paint this around the edges. And then I will press it dry. When I'm pressing with my iron, if I'm using Templar or heat resistant Templar, then I want to make sure that my iron is hot enough that it's going to dry my sizing or my best press, but not so hot that it's warping my template plastic, because I should be able to use these circles over and over and over again. I don't use steam when I'm using them, and I do just kind of press around the edges, and then I'll flip it around and finish pressing to make sure it's completely dry. So I've starched and pressed my circle. So now all I'm going to do is clip some of those running stitches. We don't need them anymore, but you don't need to pull them out. And then just fold back and pull out my template so it is usable again. And I have a nice smooth circle. And so that's going to go in the middle of my Dresden wreath. And I'm going to go ahead and put some temporary creases in here so that I can get it centered. I want to make sure I'm covering up my seam allowance, so if you cut it close, then just make sure that you have it covering on both sides. You want it centered. And I'm kind of looking at my seams and having my creases go meet in a couple of them. So when you're happy with it, with your centering job, then you're just going to pin it in place, and again, it needs to be stitched down. I'm going to hand stitch mine, but you don't have to. You can use a sewing machine. You could use a decorative stitch. You could use a buttonhole stitch. You could use a straight stitch. Use a blind hem stitch with invisible thread. Whatever you choose to do. So there, I'll stitch it down and come back. Here's my finished Dresden wreath. If you didn't trim down your background to 12.5 before you put your wreath onto it, then you do need to trim it down now. In your kit for the basket block, you have a white rectangle, you have a pink strip or rectangle, a yellow strip or rectangle, a teal square, and tealish green, and a teal rectangle. First thing I'm going to do on my white rectangle is just square up 2 edges. Let's do it down here. Doesn't matter which side we start with. Okay, and from this first edge, I'm going to cut a 3 1/4 inch strip. So I'm going to line up the 3 1/4 here with that straight edge, and I'm going to line up any line with the other edge that I've straightened, and I'm going to cut. And out of that, I need 2 3 1/4 inch squares. So 2 times 3 1/4 would be 6 1/2. So I have my 6 1/2 inch mark here, and any straight lines along the edges. I'm going to cut. Going to back my ruler up to 3 1/4. And again, I have other straight lines along here, and I know I'm off center here. And cut. So there's my 2 3 1/4 inch squares. And now I need 2 2 5/8 inch strips out of here. Well, 2 5/8 plus 2 5/8 is 5 1/4. So I'm going to just cut a 5 1/4 inch strip off of here. So I should have 5 1/4 along the short edge, any line along the bottom edge that I straightened. Now those 2 5/8 inch strips are going to be 4 3/4 high. I know this is kind of some weird cutting. 4 3/4. So I'm just going to cut the whole thing down to that right now. You could cut these one at a time if you want to. Let me just double check that. 4 3/4. 1 2 3 4 3/4. If I cut that in half, so I would just be lining up my 2 5/8 inch mark here. Again, I want lines on my other edge, but I have my 2 5/8 right here along this edge, and cut. So that gives me those 2 rectangles. And then out of what's left here, I need a 5.5 inch square. So these are my 2 edges that are clean cut. So I'm going 5.5. Cut and cut. I'm going to cut that in half on the diagonal once. So just point to point. I need one of these triangles, but from the other one, I'm just going to cut a 2 5/8 inch square. So I have my 2 5/8 inch mark here and here. I'm going to cut and cut. So that is my white. From my pink strip, I need 3 3¼ inch squares. So I'm going to straighten 2 edges. And 3¼ times 3 is 9 3/4. I'm going to go the 9 3/4 mark down on this short edge that I just straightened. My 3¼ inch mark on my long edge. I'm going to cut and cut. And then I'm going to back it up to 6.5. And cut. And then back to 3¼ and cut. From my yellow rectangle, I need 2 3¼ inch squares. So I'm going to clean up 2 edges. Three and a quarter times 2 is 6.5, so I'm lining my 6.5 inch line up on the short end, my 3¼ on my long straight edge. Cut and cut. Going to move back to 3¼ and cut. One of these I want to keep as a square, and the other I'm going to cut in half once on the diagonal. So if you want to, you can put your 45-degree line on one straight edge. That helps keep it all straight. And I'm going to cut from point to point. Give me 2 triangles. From my teal square, which in our case is the gingham, I need a 6.5 inch square. So I need something bigger than my 6 inch wide ruler. And I'm kind of trying to keep the gingham straight, although it's not printed straight, so. Cut, cut, so my 2 edges. Walk around and cut it down to 6.5 inches. So it's 6.5 inches on the 2 edges that I just straightened up. I'm going to cut this square in half once on the diagonal. So again, if you want to, you can put that 45-degree line on one of the straight edges. That just helps to make sure you truly are getting it point to point. And cut. I need one of those triangles. And then out of what's left in the other triangle, I'm going to cut a 3¼ inch square. So my 3¼ mark is here and here. It's just barely coming out of it. Cut, cut. These 2 pieces are scrap. And then I'm going to cut this square in half once on the diagonal. So again, with the 45-degree line if you want. And cut. For my large rectangle of teal, and it's the one with the pots of flowers on it, I need two 7.5-inch squares. I'm going to thin cut one edge. And the other edge. I like to do it better when I can do two at once, but it's gotten too big. Okay, so now this ruler is 15 inches, and I really don't like lining up just the edge of my ruler with my cut line. I prefer a line, so I'm going to cut these one at a time for my 7.5 inches. So I have 7.5 inches here and 7.5 inches on the short edge. I'm going to start here, and then it doesn't really matter. I was trying to avoid cutting into the next piece. So there's one, and then another 7.5 inches. Okay, there's my two squares. And I'm cutting both of these in half once on the diagonal. So I'm doing the 45-degree line thing again right here along one of my cut edges. My ruler's lined up point to point, cut, and just do that once more. That finishes the cutting for the basket. We're marking the wrong side of all three pink squares for half square triangle units, so you should be familiar with that by now. It's either one line point to point, and so 1/4 of an inch away from that line, or use a magic wand or similar tool, in which case we're putting our scored line on the points and drawing on both sides. And in this case, we would be stitching on the lines. So we're going to match these pink squares up. 2 of them are going to go with the white squares, and 1 of them is going to go with the yellow square. So we will sew either 1/4 of an inch away from your single line on both sides, or if you mark 2 lines, you're going to sew on the lines. After sewing our 2 lines, we just need to cut these apart between the 2 lines. Scissors or rotary cutter, it doesn't matter. And then we are going to press toward the pink on all of them. Now, with the yellow one, you're only going to need 1 of the 2, so you can just put 1 aside, save it for some other project. We need to trim all of these blocks down to 2 5/8, and I have shown before how to do it with a regular square ruler or the block lock. I'm just going to use the block lock today. So I have my ridge riding on my seam. I want to check to make sure that I'm going to have 2 5/8, and this is just kind of an odd measurement this time, but that's okay, we can do that. I cut 2 sides, spin it around, slide it back, and we're not going to be on one of the solid lines this time. I'm on the 2 5/8 inch mark on both sides, and trim. So I'm going to trim down 5 of those, all 4 of the pink and white and just 1 of the pink and yellow. We're ready to start sewing our rows together. So we're going to use our 2 5/8 inch white square with 2 of our half square triangles, and we're going to make this row. Then we're going to use our yellow and pink half square triangle with 1 of the pink and white ones, as well as a yellow triangle, and we're going to sew this row together. Now, when I'm sewing a triangle on like this, I'm matching this edge. I'm not worrying about this point. I don't care if it's hanging off. I want this straight edge to match up. And then the last row is a pink and white half square triangle with a yellow triangle on it. Here are my rows sewn together, and the pattern says press in the direction of the arrows, but I don't have any arrows on my pattern, so here's what I did. On this first row, I pressed toward the white square. On the second row, I pressed down towards the yellow triangle, and on the third row, I pressed away from the yellow triangle so that all my seams are going opposite directions. And then the pattern is kind of vague. It doesn't really tell us to sew these rows together, but that's exactly what we need to do. So we're going to be matching up this seam line and this seam line. So those are going to be points there that you're going to want to pay attention to. And then this one goes here. And again, points there and there you're going to be wanting to pay attention to. So I'm matching up my seams. I'm not worrying about this yellow hanging down here at this point. I'm just sewing right off the edge. Here are my rows sewn together, and at this point I pressed my seams open because there's getting to be so much bulk in some of these points. So this is the top of our basket. We do need to trim off our yellow now. So what I'm doing is I want 1/4 of an inch beyond my center point, which is right there. And I'm also, just because I can, lining up my 45-degree line with a seam there, so that keeps everything straight. I'm going to trim that off. Next, I'm going to add my gingham teal triangle to the bottom, and yes, it is bigger. I think I probably will try to center this, so I would just fold it in half, put a crease in there, and that crease is going to match up with this point. And other than that, I would be sewing on this side so I can kind of see where that point is. After sewing my large triangle on, I pressed toward the triangle, the big triangle. And now we need to trim this down so it's a square. So we're cutting it even with the pink, which should be at 6 7/8. So I'm going to actually line up my 6 7/8 marks, and I'm pretty good. And then trim the extra off of our triangle. So now that's the center part of our basket. Next, we're going to take our 2 white rectangles that we have and sew our gingham triangles to the short end. Pay attention because they do need to be a mirror image like this. Again, when I sew, I'm going to be lining up my straight edge of my triangle with my rectangle. After the sewing the triangles to the rectangles, press toward the triangles, and now we're going to sew these to the 2 sides of our basket. So the top of our rectangle is going to be lining up here with the pink and white half square triangles, and we'll just sew right off the edge with these guys, with these triangles. I've sewn the 2 rectangle triangle pieces on the edge, and then it gets pressed in toward the basket. So again, we're going to trim off, leaving 1/4 of an inch below this line, and this time I'm going to run lines along my straight lines in the block here so that I'm keeping all that straight. So I still want my 1/4 of an inch right off the tip of my basket, but rather than worry about that 45-degree line and it being perfect, I'm looking up here to see that everything's staying straight. I'm going to trim, and then my next step is to add my white triangle to the bottom of the basket. You can center it if you want to, but we will be trimming it down, so visual centering is fine. After sewing my white triangle on, I pressed toward the white, and now we need to square this up again. At this point, your block should be 9 inches. If you're only off a hair, don't worry about it, because we're going to be trimming up again later. Because I'm off right in here a little bit, but I can fudge that. But I'm just going to square this off. See where I said I was off? It's not perfectly straight there. So when I go to add the piece onto it, I'm going to line up here and go as far as I can, but then I'll just go beyond the edge of my block there. Okay, so we're down to the last thing we have to do, and that is adding our teal triangles to all 4 sides. So when I'm doing this, I add to opposite sides first, and I'll be sewing with the block on top so I can see and not flip up my seams. And then I'll come back and add the remaining 2 sides. You can fold to find your center if you want to, or you can just visually center. It's not hugely oversized, but it is oversized a little bit. Here's my block all sewn together. And once I sewed the triangles to the outside edges, I pressed out toward the triangles. Oh, and here's my spot that I said I was going to fudge. So I lined it up here, and since my white was on top, I had my straight line down here, and I just sewed it normal. But I don't have a full 1/4 inch in there. So now we're going to trim this block down to 12.5 inches. So half of 12.5 is 6 1/4. So I want my 6 1/4 mark coming through the center of my block, both directions preferably. And I would like my 1/4 inch mark to be right there on my points. It's pretty good. If it's off a little bit, then just center it the best you can. When you're happy with it, we're going to cut 2 sides. Once you've cut 2 sides, you are pretty much committed, unless you overcut. I made it bigger than it needed to be. So now I'm lining my 12.5 inch mark up with the 2 edges that I just cut. I'm going to double check my 1/4 inch here. And then I'm going to cut the remaining 2 sides, which gives me a finished 12.5 inch basket block. Well, finished, it'll be 12 inches. Hopefully you saw that it wasn't too difficult. You just had to take it step by step and pay attention to directions. I mean, the orientation of blocks.